Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second seminar in our series on educating for justice. This evening, we've got Danny Sweeney from Justice and Peace Scotland, who's going to talk to us on Catholic social teaching and migration. As usual, like last time, if anyone's got any questions throughout the talk, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll have a bit of time after Danny's talk to have a bit of a discussion. I'm sure that this will be quite a stimulating topic that's going to raise lots of issues. I'll introduce Danny briefly and then I will hand over and we can listen from him. So Danny is the Social Justice Coordinator for Justice and Peace Scotland. He studied international relations at university and then went on to volunteer with the Salesians of Don Bosco as a youth animator at their retreat centre. Danny's travelled to India, working with street children, displaced child soldiers in Bangalore, and he's also worked in ESL education in both China and the UK, and in HIV/AIDS education in Malawi as part of the International Citizenship Service Programme for Progressio. He has also worked as a civil servant in the Home Office, working on issues of asylum and migration, including time as an asylum decision maker and as a technical specialist and team leader. His current role in Justice and Peace Scotland, Danny joined there in January 2017 in the newly created role of Social Justice Coordinator, and he's been integral to engaging both the Justice and Peace Office and the Church across Scotland with issues of social justice and peace building. He regularly undertakes commitments in parishes, schools and social groups to deliver talks, training and facilitate programmes on a range of issues. He develops and leads on Encounter Calais, which is a project engaging members of the Catholic community to witness and participate in work on the front line of the UK border and to advocate for the rights of refugees when they return home. He's also developed and leads on Beyond the Walls, which is a multi-agency project exploring the lay, apostolate and Catholic social teaching for schools and parishes in Scotland. Specialist work draws on his background, engages on issues of child rights, asylum and migration, and Catholic social teaching within youth ministry. And he's also served as the Catholic Church Observer on the Church of Scotland's Church and Society Council and represents the Bishops' Conference of Scotland on various national and international bodies. So all of this to say that he's a great person to come and talk to us on migration, has had a lot of practical experience in this area as well. And today he's going to give a talk, Faith Impels Us to Hospitality, Catholic Social Teaching and Migration. I'll hand over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you for inviting me. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. I hope people can see that. Yes, no, yep. Okay, super. So yeah, I just want to start the scene set the scene with a short video. The footage is taken from the Old Jungle, which is the name given to the camp that was in Calais between 2015 and 2016. And the voices you're going to hear speaking are a mix of residents of the camp and also some volunteers.
Open up the border. Open up the border door. Open up the border. Open up the border door.
Take a walk in their shoes and try to understand.
Home is not just about a roof
and a muddy piece of land.
Home is about a family.
And the ones they took away.
swept up by the seas.
And the endless warring days.
Take a walk in their shoes.
And see their pain and scars.
The suffering behind them.
And the trucks that just drive past.
Take a walk in their shoes.
The steps they have had to take.
To make it across the ocean.
To try to change their fate.
Take a walk in their shoes.
And try to understand.
Home is not just about a roof.
And a muddy piece of land.
Think about the fact
that you wouldn't just run away.
Of course you wouldn't do it.
Unless you couldn't stay.
Take a walk in their shoes.
And see their pain and scars.
The suffering behind them.
and the trucks that just drive past.
Take a walk in their shoes.
The steps they've had to take.
To make it across the ocean.
To try and change their fate.
Do you think you'd choose to live
in a makeshift home of wood?
Surely you would stay at home.
If only you actually could.
And yet you found smiling.
as they greet you to say hello?
Volunteers there every day.
They come
And then they go.
Take a walk in their shoes.
Standing together side by side.
Only one born in a country.
Not actually experiencing the fight.
So people won't you listen?
Governments want you here.
There's a humanitarian crisis.
And it's happening far too near.
Jump on board a ferry.
Tunnel under the sea.
Just find a place in your heart.
Of where you think they'd rather be.
Take a walk in their shoes.
And join them by the shore.
Please help them find a home.
Just stop the senseless war.
So faith impels us to hospitality. The title for this seminar, it actually comes from an address by Pope Francis that he gave. It was in Greece late last year to people at a refugee reception centre. This does come with the apologies due to the short time. This talk's probably going to be broader than it is deep. There's a lot I'd love to go into on so many things, but just with the time we have to try and sort of give people a quick snapshot. I want to look at this idea of hospitality and particularly the whats and the wheres that have formed my view and my feelings on this. We'll have a quick look around the issues of the language and the terminology that's used, the very politicized language that we have on these issues, to try and address some of that and to give us a common place to start from. I'm going to pick up and explore briefly the thread of migration that runs through our tradition, both the scriptures and through that body of documents that form Catholic social teaching, along with a bit of a historical context to things. And then I'll set out a couple of ideas as to why does any of this matter. So hopefully we'll do that, and hopefully my connection will last. Yeah, the idea of a migrant crisis, it's a label that the press and the current UK government really do play up to. It's inaccurate, it's misleading, and it is driving a lot of the bad legislation and policy that we're currently seeing, which I will come to. As Anna said, before I came up here, I was working in the Home Office, I was working in asylum, and there's all sorts I could say about that, but I'll just say it's a very dehumanizing process that the Home Office puts people through, both those who are asking for asylum and those who are working there. You're not meant to see people as humans. Things are reduced to units of work. And again, there's all sorts I could say there, but I won't. And I came to Scotland to work for Justice and Peace Scotland, and this issue, the day I interviewed for this job was the day that the old camp, the old jungle in Calais, was being demolished. And I watched this happen on the TV while I was waiting to go in for my interview. And then later, when I started the job, the camp had gone, but the issue had not. People were still coming. The problem was still there. And so with the support of Bishop Nolan, Archbishop Nolan as he is now, and our chair at the time, Honor Hania, who I think might be on the call actually, but with the support of both Honor and Archbishop Nolan, we engaged with this. We said we're going to look at this. So having been to Calais, I went to Calais as part of the Home Office clearance of young families when people were being dispersed across France, about a week after I knew I'd got this job. But with this job, I managed to go back. And actually, I went as a volunteer, and I went with Justice and Peace Scotland, and I got to spend some time. And one of the most inspiring people I have the privilege to know is a Benedictine monk called Brother Johannes Martins. He was the founder of Maria Skoptsova Catholic Worker House. It's a house of hospitality in Calais where I volunteered, and when JMP Scotland takes volunteers, we always make sure we go and meet the community there to hear from them. The icon, Maria Skoptsova, for those who don't know, is a fascinating, absolutely fascinating saint. She's Russian Orthodox. She's a poet, a revolutionary, a Bolshevik. and later she lived as a refugee in France, and she became a nun, but not to go into the convent, but to live in a house of hospitality, living in the world particularly amongst refugees, other displaced Russians amongst them, and she's well worth reading more about. But this idea here, and I'd say this is a quote from Johannes, we don't have a migrant crisis, we don't have a refugee crisis, we have a crisis of hospitality in our culture. It's not first and foremost about the people who are coming in or who are asking for help. The crisis is failing to offer welcome, it's our failing to offer compassion, it's a lack of empathy. And that can be at all levels, personal, community, and also state level. The crisis of hospitality is what's at the root of the challenge that we're facing. So if nothing else from this afternoon, that thought, I hope, is worth thinking further on for people. In terms of language, there's friends of mine who do a lot of work in Birmingham with educators and looking at refugee issues. And they said the other day they'd spoken to 500 teachers, and only 3 or 4 of them knew, when they were put on the spot, the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker. So very, very quickly, and just to give the basics, an asylum seeker, it's someone who has asked a foreign government for protection from their own country. That decision is still being processed. They are seeking asylum, seeking international protection. A refugee is someone who's been recognised as being in need of that international protection and has been given that status. It's a protected status of person. Refugees, asylum seekers form a very, very small group of people within the very broad term of migrant or migration, literally, people who have moved. Asylum and refugee convention, it's a very narrow window to try and get through. The definition that I've got here, it's from the United Nations. It's a body called the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees, who exists to uphold a thing called the Refugee Convention. And this is the beginning of it. It's who is a refugee? It is a person who has a fear of being persecuted for specific reasons, is outside of their own country, and because of that persecution are not prepared to ask their own country to protect them. That's what the UNHCR exists to do, and that's what the Refugee Convention, which passed in 1951, does. And again, there's all sorts we could go into, but just, I think, to keep in mind, it's a very narrow criteria. It was when it was passed, and it hasn't changed a great deal since then. There have been some developments, but fundamentally, this is still a very narrow door that people are trying to get through. The other term we hear a lot in the press misused really badly, is the idea of migrant. Migrant, it's a very broad term. And again, here, this is from the UNHCR. This is a working guide. So refugees are forced to flee. Migrant is anyone who moves, and it can be for a range of purposes, usually across an international border. So again, it's worth keeping in mind. We hear this misapplied a lot. The waters get sort of muddied even further, especially in sort of church and faith communities. What's happened over the last few years, I believe, in response to the politicization of the language, is people will use the term refugee way beyond the definition that the UNHCR puts forward. And I've had sort of conversations with people who will say things like, oh, I know this refugee who's been here 10 years and is still waiting for their decision. And my inner pedant, inner bureaucrat sort of kicks in, ready to hash out all the reasons that sentence is wrong. I've stopped doing it. I've got much better since I escaped the civil service. But people will use this term much more broadly. And the best example of this, to actually sort of codify it, came from JRS, the Jesuit Refugee Service. So they would say, the idea of a de facto refugee. It's people fleeing persecution for all the reasons, but also armed conflicts, erroneous economic policy, and natural disasters. And you can see there, it's a much more holistic definition. It provides that dignity. Refugee is a more recognised and protected term, and it's used much more broadly. So you get why people would struggle to pin down all of these terms, because they are used quite fluidly in some cases, and they are certainly misused a lot as well. I want to quickly pick up this idea of migration that really does flow through our faith all the way. The earliest books of the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, are, broadly speaking, our Old Testament. Migration, travel, movement, runs through this. The family of Jacob moved to Egypt to escape a famine. And then generations later, the Exodus sees Moses leading them back out of Egypt to escape persecution and slavery. The Exodus from Egypt becomes central to the Jewish identity, and the instruction to welcome the widow, the orphan, the stranger, because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. It becomes the most repeated instruction that we find cropping up through Scripture. It appears over 50 times in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy, specific laws and specific instructions are given that shape that welcome. And again, we could go into it properly, but it boils down to you must treat the stranger the same as you treat your own people. You must look after them, you must welcome them, you must protect them the same as you protect your own people. And then further, the great example is, if you have a field full of grain, if you have a field of crops, you must leave the edges so they can be gleaned, so those, the poor, the widow, the orphan, stranger, can take the grain from them so they will not starve. We also see popping up throughout Scripture the special place that's given to outsiders, the people who today would carry those labels of migrant, refugee, asylum seeker, victim of human trafficking, victim of modern slavery as well. We put in modern language. Even back before the Exodus in Genesis, we have Hagar, an enslaved foreigner who is running from mistreatment by her mistress, Sarah. She's comforted by God and she names him as El Roi, the God who sees us. Later, there's Ruth, the Moabitess, Moabites outsiders to the Israelis in every way, but she joins Israel. She becomes part of a cross-cultural marriage, the grandmother of Jesse, great-grandmother to David, and a line that then flows down to Jesus himself. And again, for everyone here, I know Jesus' own story picks up this pattern, this story. Born away from the family home in Nazareth, he's born in Bethlehem, immediately forced to become a refugee to seek safety in Egypt, away from persecution by Herod, by the state, by the powerful. And then throughout Jesus' own scriptures, he works, he travels around. In one of the passages of Scripture, which an awful lot of later CST will draw on and a lot of teaching will look at, is Matthew 25. Jesus is teaching on the Last Judgment, where hospitality and compassion to all those in need become the benchmark. These are the questions that we will all be asked and expected to answer on the day of judgment. And again, there's so much more we could go into if we had time in Scripture, and also probably people on this call far more qualified than me to walk us through it. Move to the keeping that thread going into documents that we have for social teaching. As Anna sort of said last month, and 1891, Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII is really the first book that we look to, and it's out to establish the rights and the dignity of work and for workers. And if that work can't be found, a necessity to move, and just to quote there, no one would exchange his country if his own afforded a decent living and a happy life. So straight from the beginning of these documents that we explore, migration's there. We're not perhaps talking about asylum seekers, we're not talking about persecution, we're talking about dignity, the right to life, the right to work. One of the biggest inputs, Exul Familia Nazarenthia, Pope Pius XII's document. It came in 1952, and I think if we accept the idea that at its heart, social teaching is about reading the signs of the times. Of course, this is just 1 year after the Refugee Convention has been signed and passed, that Pius releases this apostolic constitution. And it's worth keeping in mind, I think it's always, whenever we talk about the Refugee Convention, the people who wrote these documents, these are the people who lived through World War II. They saw the horrors of the Holocaust, and they saw the displacement of people as the Cold War divided Europe. That's the background. If you ever want to understand what the Refugee Convention is trying to do, just keep the Holocaust in mind. And it really does show just what a powerful document it was and who wrote it. Exul Familia Nazarenthia, this is the opening paragraph. The Holy Family fleeing to Egypt are the archetypes of every refugee. They are for all times and places the models and protectors of every migrant, whether compelled by fear of persecution or by want. This could be coming from Pope Francis here and now. It's not, it comes from Pope Pius. There's a couple more documents I just want to briefly flag up just to give a bit more context. Both of these come from Pope John the 23rd, Mater et Magistra and Passim et Terris. Again, neither are specifically about our documents on migration, but one speaks of the need to address the imbalance and the other explores issues of rights and the relationships between the states. What I find interesting this time, so we're 10, 12 years after the Refugee Convention. The church is ahead of certainly the Refugee Convention, ahead of the UNHCR, and ahead of most people. It's actually quite a groundbreaking for its time way of looking at this stuff. The Refugee Convention is very narrow and very specific. It's race, religion, political opinion, particular social group, that is it. Already we're seeing the church look at opportunity, finding those spaces where people can thrive and have a good life. There's a sociologist working in peace studies who's called Johan Galtung, who put forward a theory called structural violence. And his idea is that extreme poverty, as part of a nexus of issues including domestic abuse, gender-based violence, racism, classism, sexism, all of these, they can potentially be as damaging to a person's development, life, as war and as conflict and as persecution. Poverty can be as damaging to an individual as war. Galton published in 1969, obviously John the 23rd here is writing before that, but still to this day, the Refugee Convention does not apply to cases of extreme poverty. And in terms of the climate crisis and displacement through the climate crisis, it's only very, very recently in the last couple of years, and it's only a couple of decisions by a couple of nations that have started to even think about that as a ground. So the church really was well ahead in the application and in the realities of migration and of displacement, even than the UNHCR. I don't have time to go into all the documents, just sort of a quick overview of some of the other documents that are out there where this thread continues through. And again, obviously, we have on the left there are papal teaching and Gaudium et Spes, one of the constitutions of the Second Vatican Council. And on the right are other documents issued by the church. All of them, to greater or lesser degrees, will pick up on migration, pick up on people in need. Latterly, we have Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, both of whom tend to place refugees in broader categories of those in need of support, those in need of special care. So it'll be things like victims of war, food insecurity, global inequality, and both of them do refer back to that Matthew 25, that last judgment passage, as the call to action on these issues. Pope Benedict in particular builds on his predecessors, and he's a very strong advocate for both multinational cooperation, for international organizations, the UNHCR, the IOM, International Organization of Migration. They should create well-ordered systems which can manage migration flows and not leave people at risk of further exploitation, further harm, as increasingly we do begin to see. I want to move on recently to Francis, and I mean, I would argue is one of possibly the only leader on the world stage at the moment who is unflinching in his support of refugees, regardless of where they're from. These last few days, the terrible things we're seeing in Ukraine, there's suddenly leaders who are very open and very welcome, prepared to take in Ukrainians, which is wonderful. But some of them are the exact same people who have been bitterly opposed to taking in refugees coming from outside of Europe over recent years. Francis, I think we all know, is not. His pontificate has coincided with a marked increase in forced migration, displacement globally. Just a few numbers. 2014, the number of displaced people equaled 65.5 million, which is the number that were displaced in Europe post-World War II, which obviously led to the Refugee Convention. So that number was matched in 2014. And then since 2016, the number has been higher year on year. And we're currently at 82 million displaced people. And of that, about 26 million are recognised as refugees. We're also seeing, again, coinciding with Pope Francis's pontificate and the times we're living in, there's far greater public awareness and there's far greater media coverage, technology which exposes the previously unseen, ungoverned spaces which migrants have to pass through as part of their journeys, the treatments they receive at the borders of spaces. I mean, the best example, think of the slave markets that are in the ports of Libya today on the border of Frontex, which is the European common border. And we also have greater access through technology to see what's happening on the lawless, the ocean or sea areas, which so many people are forced to cross. You know, those stories have always been there, those experiences have always been there. Increasingly, there is awareness because technology is allowing us to see this. Francis has made ministry to these borders, to people being displaced, the key call of his papacy, the creation and his personal leadership of the refugees and migrants section of our Dicastery for Integral Human Development, which is the Vatican body that Justice and Peace sits under. We've not yet had a new church document specifically on migration, but the thread does continue through Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, and Fratelli Tutti. And we've also seen Francis reshape the church's approach. In, I think, one of the earliest acts he did as Pope, he went to the island of Lampedusa in southern Italy, again, where lots of people are coming into Europe. And in his address there, it's the picture at the top with the lectern with the wheel. He didn't focus on the Last Judgment. He didn't focus on the flight to Egypt. He went to the book of Genesis, and he went with the first two questions that God asks mankind. The first one is, Adam, where are you? And to Cain, where is your brother? Francis is less concerned with appealing to international organizations to get the job done and to sort themselves out. The answer to the challenge of migration, which, you know, as I've said, is the challenge of hospitality. It's not just at the state level, it's at community level, and it's at the personal humanitarian approach. Francis, in his writings and in his speeches, invariably those questions he comes back to: where are you? Where is your brother? Where is your brother who is in modern slavery? Where is your brother trapped in a sweatshop? Where is your brother in a dinghy? The very intimate personal responsibility, you know, I am my brother's keeper. Francis comes back to time and again, picking up on those questions that he posed at Lampedusa. I would also add he's not abandoned his predecessor's approach. He does still look for proper state and international responses, you know, and most noticeably the Vatican engaged with a thing called the Global Compact on Migration, which was signed in 2018, which was an attempt to sort of refresh and recommit to the ideals of the Refugee Convention. And he personally led the migrants and refugees section in the build up to that work. And he sums up, he shapes his approach around 4 verbs, which are to welcome, to protect, to promote, and to integrate. And he's come back to this sort of time and time again to push this idea. And for Francis, he said, if we to do all this properly, you know, if we are, you know, to welcome properly, we'd be looking at states giving safe legal routes to people who need them, to supporting them when they arrive, making it easier to raise claims for asylum, access to the services that are needed. And for me, that would certainly be far above the very basic function of shelter, which certainly in this country is done to prevent destitution as a commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights. But far beyond that, you know, I would want to see support for physical, mental health needs, language, skills classes, even things like mechanisms to recognise sort of foreign, you know, already held qualifications, right to seek employment, you know, for those who wish it, because at the moment, most refugees are facing indeterminable weight where they're banned from working and contributing in the societies that they're now in. To protect, again, this would be to uphold fundamental human rights, and regardless of legal status, and like I hinted at before, through the asylum process, it's a transitional thing, the status you have when you are an asylum seeker to when you're a refugee to when you hopefully gain some form of permanent residence and citizenship. You know, the upholding of fundamental rights at all stages, regardless, I would say certainly is needed as part of that protection. And also the specific rights of the Refugee Convention to refugees, and also particularly thinking of children, the special rights which the Convention on the Rights of the Child assigns to them. States should be far more proactive and vocal about upholding and promoting these things to children. to promote, again, it's ensuring, and I'd say, both state and community, the conditions for healthy, good development of people according to their needs, the capacities, and those of the local community that they're living in. So this will be looking at education and opportunities in local communities, certainly for personal engagement, that chance. How often do we get to meet people? Are people being locked away in areas where we can't get to them, where they can't meet, they can't integrate, they can't actually begin to rebuild their lives with a community, be that a faith community, a civil community, but a community around them to support them. We'd also want to see, perhaps at the state or at the state level, an extension of voting rights to asylum seekers while they are resident in the country waiting for their claim to be decided. We saw in Scotland a couple of years ago that the voting was extended to refugees. But unfortunately, SNP and Tory MSPs together voted down a Green amendment, which would have taken us that step further and given voting rights to asylum seekers while they're in Scotland. So I think we are doing very, very well, but there are steps to go further, certainly at that state. And then in terms of to integrate, the last one of the verbs, we want to look at what can be done to let people live together and live well. There's no point throwing hundreds of asylum seekers into the poorest communities, away from transport, away from cultural links, away from educational opportunities, away from everything. And then, angrily shaking your fist and writing to the Daily Mail saying these people don't want to talk to us. We need to have a system where people can integrate, can live, and can benefit from intercultural encounter and active citizenship. And that goes, that must go both ways between both host country and those who are asking asylum in it. So those are a few of my thoughts on Pope Francis. This picture, this came up the weekend. It's a mural up in Milan. Obviously, we know the last few days Pope Francis extraordinarily went to the Russian embassy to plead for peace and has been in contact with the Ukrainians. This mural has popped up in Milan with Francis rescuing a child from a bombed out city. And I think even sort of, 8-9 years into his pontificate, people still, he's been tarnished by the global stage. He's not been destroyed by, like so many politicians would be. He still has that image of the one who cares, and the one is still the same man who went to Lampedusa, cry for humanity. So I just want to share that. Why does any of this matter? The big question, I suppose. Firstly, for me, what does this reveal to us about God? In migration, we see the nature of God. He speaks to Moses. It's because he has heard the cry of people oppressed and enslaved and is going to act to deliver them. In the flight to Egypt, we see the faith that Joseph and Mary are placing in that message of God's angel. They run to safety in Egypt, this place that looms large in Jewish memory as the place of enslavement. How scared must you be, but how much trust must you be prepared to place to go seek safety in the home of the old enemy? And then at the end of Luke's gospel, the journey to Emmaus, the meal at Emmaus, the two disciples have traveled on the road with the stranger. The stranger looks to go on. It's when they ask him to stay, when they invite the stranger to join them and stay with them and offer hospitality, that they see Jesus revealed to them in the breaking of bread. So a God who sees us, who sees injustice and acts to change it, who will protect his people through dangerous foreign lands, and is revealed to us as the stranger in our midst. I'm sure there are theologians on the call who could point out all the things that are wrong with my theory, but I'm not a theologian, I'm an activist. Moving to why does any of this matter for us in Scotland in 2022, and especially for our teachers, for our educators. This picture, this was from the Times this morning, and I'm sure people have seen the news enough to know what is being alluded to. Quite simply, this is going to be the defining challenge of, certainly I would say, my generation and of the coming years. This question of how we are going to respond to the crisis of hospitality. It's going to shape us, it's going to shape our society, and it's going to shape, certainly I would say, our conversation as a church. We're going to be judged by the future, is what I would say. We're going to, the same way we look at those who took the wrong side of history in the debate over emancipation and the slave trade, the late 18th, early 19th century, we're going to be judged by how we respond to the crisis of hospitality. And right now we have in the UK a government who are committed to policies and to legislation which are performatively punitive against the vulnerable. What I mean by this performatively punitive, the government, a Home Office, and certainly fronted by the Home Secretary, who are quite happy to play to the gallery, the press, in the way it treats those who come to us asking for our help, asking for safety. It's not just denying the rights to work. It's not just seeking to frustrate asylum claims at every stage. This is wanting to build detention centres on volcanic islands thousands of miles away to process claims for the UK. This is wanting to put wave machines in the channel with the aim of swamping the boats. If you swamp a boat, you will kill the people on board it. It's wanting to put the Navy with gunships in the channel. This idea of turning back boats, we want to turn guns on desperate people. This is housing people in condemned, abandoned military barracks. It's making all these announcements with great media coverage and applause from the absolute worst natures of our humanity, but then quietly rowing back as the courts, the United Nations, even the Navy, in one case, the Navy has made it clear they're not going to do what the Home Secretary is asking. We've developed a culture where we will drag the national debate to the gutter and spend several weeks asking whether the lifeboat service is enabling human trafficking, and even will draft into legislation, something that would make the rescuing of someone in need at sea an illegal act. This is one of the oldest laws and customs of the sea, and yet they put it out there to see if it will play. I mean, today, literally, as we're sitting here, the House of Lords is at the report stage of the government's anti-refugee bill. The proper name for this is the Nationality and Borders Bill, but it's the anti-refugee bill. And it's the legislation built on lies and nonsense. And in the government's own words, it is designed to deter to the maximum extent those seeking asylum coming here after being forced to flee their own homelands. It breaks the Refugee Convention. You will have heard, you will hear, Home Secretary Patel and others lying in Parliament to say that's not the case. They are lying, and the UNHCR has effectively said so. It seeks to strip the rights from people to seek asylum who come to the UK through any means other than arriving on a flight directly from your home country. So if you have the money and the visas and the power to fly direct, we'll consider you. Everyone else, won't be looked at. Anyone who passes through another country will effectively not be allowed to raise a claim for asylum. UK government guidance was updated on Friday night, and at the moment it confirms that Ukrainians who cross Europe in that way will be subject to the same restrictions. So, I mean, Friday night, as the bombs were falling on Ukraine, we've seen Ireland has waived all visa needs, and the EU has suspended the need for visas or passports for the next 3 years for Ukrainians. This means that they can live and work in the EU without needing to claim asylum for a period of 3 years. And again, I could go into why that's an incredible gesture. It really does mean a lot. What we have is the government and its supporters setting themselves on a diametrically opposed path to what Pope Francis is calling for. The anti-refugee bill will, amongst other things, allow for detention camps to become the norm. Even here in the UK, the impact of this, compared with the community accommodation, which is the current model, it's locking people away. It's locking people away from those communities, faith, civil, whoever, local communities, to stop them integrating. Pope Francis, in the speech he gave, where I drew the title of this from, he remembers saying, he quotes Patriarch Bartholomew, and he says, "Those who fear you have not looked you in the eye, they have not met you, they have not seen your faces." And unfortunately, that's what's doing. And if nothing else, I don't have time to go into all the evils of this bill, but just I think it's worth knowing it has been condemned by anyone and everyone who's worth listening to on this matter. Why should this matter to teachers and educators in particular? This is where I start dropping massive responsibilities on people, so sorry about that. When we have a government that is out to lie, and we have other legislation coming forward to strip voting rights, to strip the right to protest, so many things are going in such a bad direction. It's going to fall on teachers. It's going to fall on you in our schools with the wonderful platform you have to know the facts, to know the reality, to know the truth about these issues, and to make sure not only that your students hear it, but they understand it, they believe it, and they have the critical thinking skills to be able to pick apart the lies that they will be hearing. I think the national dialogue is not going to change in the coming years. So it really is on that very privileged platform that educators have to make sure that the next generation is ready to pick up this fight for the most vulnerable, as Pope Francis asks us to do. I want to end my input this afternoon with an account that has come, actually, so I'm looking at the time, I won't put this account through. What I will just quickly share you, a couple of images from Dunkirk in September. This was a camp of about 800 people, mostly Kurdish, living in the woods. And as has happened so many times at our border, funded by our taxes and with the full support of the British government, this camp was demolished, and overnight 800 people were displaced. There is an account that was shared through volunteers from Care for Calais, which I don't have time really to read because we are going a bit late. I'll just read the very last passage. The next time someone tells you refugees crossing the Channel should stay in France because it's a safe country, show them these pictures, show everyone, because there's nothing safe about what just happened in Dunkirk, a few miles off the British coast. Thank you so much for your time. Please do drop me an email. There's far more we could talk about, and certainly with schools, you know, pre-pandemic and hopefully now as we start to move onwards. I'd love to get back into schools and talk about this stuff, about Calais, about all these issues. Drop me an email on this or any of the other topics. And if you don't already, please do follow Justice and Peace Scotland on social media. We've got loads of resources there. We constantly update the website. We're hoping in the next couple of months to be able to announce a couple of new big projects, one for students and one for educators. So please do keep an eye. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Danny, for a very powerful talk, and I think really highlighting this idea of the power of education to speak truth to power. If anyone's got any questions or comments, please put those in the chat that we can go through. I think there's lots that I think we could discuss here. I particularly enjoyed your shout out to Brother Johannes as well, who's part of the Catholic Worker Movement that I was speaking about last time in my talk. So I think we've got a question from Marianne. Marianne, do you want to read out your question for us?
Sorry about that. Took me some time to turn on. As chair of Pax Christi Scotland, I added my name to a letter which is being delivered today to the Prime Minister, signed by 1,000 religious leaders throughout the country, seeking to make the Nationality and Borders Bill more humane. Would you, Danny, think that is a good idea for others, those who are with us this evening, to write to the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister? Do you think that what's happening in Ukraine will change Westminster government's collective mind on the situation for refugees? How can we act now to make that difference?
I probably should have said when I first started, Marion was the vice chair of JMP Scotland and also supported our work in Calais. I would encourage people to write, but I would have to say it would be with very little hope of getting a positive response. I mean, over the years, Archbishop Nolan and Honor and now Jill Kent, who's our current chair, we have written on various issues to the Home Office, directly to the Home Secretary. If we get a response at all, it tends to come from one of the sort of junior immigration monkeys. So, you know, no matter how senior the flying monkey is, it's still not the Wicked Witch. They don't particularly care about our opinion, but that is not a reason not to make it heard and not to challenge. And certainly, I would say if you have a Tory MP, and again, I mean, we could say all sorts about the first past the post and issues with the structure of our democracy, but certainly if you have a Tory MP, I would be bombarding them with correspondence, details, facts, accounts of this stuff. I wouldn't let them sleep. Obviously, most of us in Scotland do not have that situation, and but for a wider audience, certainly, because it is currently, I think, Tory MPs who are the ones who are where the leverage can be, and even this afternoon before I came on the call, I think it's 37 from they labelled a sort of centrist. I don't really know what that means, but a centrist group of Tory MPs have written to the Prime Minister demanding a change over Ukraine. I think we will see some changes around Ukraine in the coming days, and bureaucracies move slowly. There is perhaps a degree of that. I don't think it will change the overall direction of travel. I think in parts this may be used. There's a narrative that this government has had for a few years, and I know colleagues of mine were told this directly by Sajid Javid when he was briefly Home Secretary. So I think that would have been the back end of Theresa May's premiership. It's been a very busy 5 years at the top of government. But I think when Sajid Javid was Home Secretary, there was a meeting, and he said they're very much aware of this good migrant, bad migrant narrative. Good migrants are the ones who will sit and wait in refugee camps until they are flown here on very limited schemes that don't really take a lot of people. Or good migrants are Hong Kongers who obviously are being brought over. Good migrants will be Ukrainians. Bad migrants are everybody who crosses the channel or who is stranded in Calais. That narrative they do feed into. I fear what's happened in Ukraine could fuel that further. It could fuel it. What I will say, because I'm aware I've sort of thrown a few shots at various governments and groups of society. So I do hope Glasgow Uni has good lawyers, but even people who we have seen change these last few days. I mean, Salvini in Italy is one, and there are some here who, having been up in arms against letting anybody into the UK to seek asylum, have now are calling for support for Ukraine. I suppose the hope. The hope is that encounter, if they can see a Ukrainian seeking asylum, seeking a Ukrainian refugee in need, hopefully there'll be the grace that their eyes can broaden to other people. I don't want to say if I'm optimistic or not, but let's just say let's hope it's grace and leave it to a higher power on that one.
Thanks so much, Danny. We've got a question from Father Stephen. Stephen, did you want to read your question out?
Yeah, hi Danny. Just a quick, actually it was pretty much a factual thing. I noticed in your graph that the big rise was due to internal displacement. Yeah, any idea what is fueling that or what situations are?
Yeah, I won't try and sort of backtrack on the slides and get them up. UNHCR numbers, most people who are displaced from their home will be internally displaced, either to a city in their own country, to the borderlands of their own country, or to the very edges of a neighbouring country. And that will always be the majority. The rise since 2016, I think it's the same rise in displacement that we're seeing globally. And obviously the Syria situation in Syria, I don't have time to sort of go into today, but with another group, I did look at what drove the sort of spike in 2014, 2015, 2016. And there's all sorts of factors. Some of them are new, some of them build on other ones. But I mean, that proportion is always going to just rise as the number of people displaced rises broadly. I mean, there was on the graph, obviously, the special criteria for Venezuelans who are, it says not refugees and not asylum seekers, but are displaced from the country. And that's quite a large number from Venezuela, particularly in Colombia, Peru, Chile, other parts of South America, some of whom are workers, some of whom have been there for a while or have gone as workers to avoid having to claim asylum. And you saw that in parts of the Syria conflict very early on. Certainly when I was in the Home Office, so 2014, 2015, obviously the war's been going about 3-4 years in Syria at that point. People who had got to, particularly to the sort of the Arab states, to the UAE and these places as workers, and were migrant workers, are suddenly running out of, their visas are running out, their employment is worried about renewing the visa because of the implications on the company. And so you were suddenly seeing people whose other options have gone, who are having to do something else. And I'll go back to a point that I dropped before. The reason that the EU giving people 3 years grace before they have to claim asylum is so wonderful. People don't want to claim asylum. Claiming asylum effectively, when you're issued with a refugee travel document, it's similar to a British passport, apart from it says you can this is for travel to all countries except your own, except the country of your birth, and it will say you cannot use this document to travel to Syria, for example, if you're from Syria. And when I was in the homes, I met people, and people did all sorts to try and put off having to ask for asylum. I think, and again, I'm using the words of others now, but it's a very final thing. People don't want to do it. You always hope that things will get better, that things will improve, that you can go back. Claiming asylum really tends to be the last option for desperate people. If you're lucky enough to have a working visa, to be a student, whatever, people put this off because it really is a very definitive line at that point for the next few years of your life. So these things happen.
Sunny, I think we've probably got time for one more quick question if anyone's got anything they want to ask.
Marion's put one about climate change, food insecurity, and it is. We're going to see climate displacement, and obviously sort of the knock-ons of food insecurity and communal tension and everything else. That is coming together. That has already happened. The Refugee Convention, it doesn't cover climate change. It doesn't cover poverty. The category, which is particular social membership of a particular social group. Again, I've not got it'd be another hour to look at that properly, but there's a couple of courts. I think certainly in Holland, though I could be wrong, but they recently, an asylum case was heard where someone was recognised as being driven from their home due to the climate. But it's not a universally accepted position. This is going to drive massive things. I mean, I know. Certainly the idea in the 90s was that the water wars were going to be the next big driver, and obviously they didn't come in the 90s, but we're certainly going to start seeing scarcity driving conflict and driving displacement.
Thanks so much, Danny. I think lots of things for us to think about there, especially I think you drew out really nicely the links between our faith life and our faith tradition, and how this plays in with migrants and refugee status. I'm going to hand over to Father Stephen now, who will close with a word of thanks.
So thanks very much, Danny, for being with us this evening, and especially for giving us, as the video started with the refrain, to allow us to take a walk in their shoes, and not just to do that, but to kind of by the end of it to make that phrase seem very strange, because it's not their shoes. You've helped us to understand there is no them and us, but we're all part of a common humanity. So thanks for that. There was so many lovely, don't want to call them sound bites, but in a negative sense, but in the most positive sense, I think to be able to sum up things in a phrase which is powerful and which remains with us has been one of the great beauties of tonight. And this idea of a crisis of hospitality in our culture is really what's at root here, a lack of compassion and empathy on many levels, and particularly how you tied that to the Last Judgment to say this is crucial. This is exactly what the Lord asks of us, and where even our salvation is going to depend on the hospitality that we have extended to the brothers and sisters who are Christ himself. And for somebody who's not a theologian and disclaims that, you were pretty good at the old theology tonight as well, I think, and just brought us to understand the biblical roots of this issue. We all know about the flight from Egypt, of course, but a reminder that came about because of Joseph and his brothers fleeing to Egypt because of famine, a situation which repeats itself so often, and the biblical Israel rooting its laws in this understanding of itself as a migrant people. And bringing it up to date, really interesting. I didn't realise in 1952, Pius XII already using the example of Jesus as the title of the encyclical So it takes us right back to there, and he helped us understand that in many ways the church has been ahead of the curve in many of these situations, and not least in terms of Francis himself. These fabulous questions of, Francis, where are you? Where is your brother? I think they'll be the things that remain with me the most. Thanks for the practical inputs as well, just superb. So many practical suggestions of recognition of academic qualifications from other countries, how transformative that would be, the ability to work, extending voting rights to asylum seekers. These are real practical things which maybe had not occurred to us before. And you ended on just such a positive and passionate note about the current regime, which is so performatively punitive, the famous hostile environment. And that would be my final word, is the same encouragement to you and your work that you've given to us, and also to everyone who's here tonight, to remember that tides can turn. And if the Times, which I do read every day and which is a right-leaning newspaper, if it can put a cartoon like that in the paper today, maybe it shows that the tide is turning in favour of us and our view of migration. And if we stick in there, if we remain faithful as teachers, as activists, as theologians, as educators, then we have to pray and hope with yourself that the tide will turn. So thank you for giving us that hope. Thank you for giving us the tools to understand how we can transform our own dreams and desires into hope for all of our brothers and sisters around the world. So in a word, a huge thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone as well. Thank you for attending. And just a reminder that we've got the next seminar coming up on Monday, the 28th of March, where the newly appointed Archbishop of Glasgow, William Nolan, will talk to us about Catholic social teaching and nuclear weapons and how this plays into education as well, looking 40 years on from the Scottish Bishop's pastoral letter. And you can register by clicking on the Zoom link that was sent out with the flyers as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and have a lovely rest of your evening.
Danny, thanks very much. Okay.
Was that okay?
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. An absolutely stimulating presentation. There might be a couple of people hanging back just to say a few words to you. So if anyone wants to say anything, then please feel free. If you're just ready to leave, then that's no problem either.
Yeah, that was really powerful. Thanks, Danny.
Incredibly powerful. And Father Stephen summed it up perfectly.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliantly.
Yeah.
Roisin, I know, have you had a chance?
Can't hear you. Did I lose him?
Yeah, I think you've cut out.